So I'm going to give just a short presentation on the past, present, and future of educational choice. It's going to be kind of like an advanced constitutional law seminar. So if it encourages you to go to law school afterward, great. And if it encourages you to not go to law school, all the better. So the presentation, there we go, is going to go over just several issues. The first is like the major US Supreme Court cases on educational choice. These are kind of going back like 30 years, right back to the founding of IJ. And you'll learn through this that sort of the history of IJ is also the history of educational choice. And we're going to talk about three major educational choice cases that came before the US Supreme Court. We'll talk about what's going on right now, and then we're going to talk about how to design good policy. So the first major educational choice case was involving the Establishment Clause. The Establishment Clause of the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. So, we all remember being back in high school and learning about the Bill of Rights. And so you have the First Amendment, and the First Amendment talks about a couple of things. One of the things it talks about is the Establishment Clause and how Congress may make no law respecting an establishment of religion. And this was really the first major question that opponents of educational choice brought to the fore. They were saying, if you have an educational choice program, by definition, some people who are participating in this, getting vouchers or scholarships to go to private schools, they're going to be taking them to religious schools. And doesn't that violate the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment? And in an IJ case, the Supreme Court roundly rejected that argument. And it was basically based off of an IJ argument that we had been developing over the years. This case was called Zellman v. Simmons Harris. It's the seminal case in 2002. And basically it had its origins in Ohio. And so in Ohio, they had one of these very, very poorly performing school districts in Cleveland. And basically, in order to give students an option to go someplace else and to have other choices, the state legislature enacted this program that would basically give students who were in Cleveland, a voucher that they would be able to take to whatever other qualifying school that they could attend. And most of these students ended up choosing religious schools, and most of the schools that participated also happened to be religious. And naturally, the opponents of educational choice, as they pretty much always do, filed a lawsuit. And they alleged this violates the Establishment Clause. And IJ, along with the different defendants, made a couple of arguments that ultimately ended up prevailing in the United States Supreme Court. And it ultimately ended up upholding this voucher program for two reasons. The first was that it was neutral in respect to religion, and that means that both religious schools and non-religious schools can participate. There's no condition on getting the voucher whether you attend one school or another. Nothing is being privileged. In other words, not everyone it's not like this is a scholarship program, but only to attend Catholic schools. And the program operated on the private choice of parents. And the court held that this broke the link between the state and the church. In the words of the court, it was basically an incidental benefit to the religious school or to any school. In the same way that if you get like a food stamp, if you qualify for that, if you get a food stamp, you choose where to spend it. It's not as if Safeway, or since we're down here in Florida, Publix has an attachment, has a guarantee to it. And if you take away that food stamp, it's not like Publix can, sue the state for taking away a benefit from it. They're only getting it incidentally as a consequence of an individual receiving that benefit. The same is true when it comes to an educational choice scholarship. So after this really crushing loss for the other side, they started shifting tactics. And what they did was they started looking at their state constitutions for other kinds of ways that they could thwart educational choice programs. Now, remember that that the first big conflicts were about the First Amendment. So we started off talking about the Establishment Clause. That question was basically solved or addressed in the Zellman case. The next question turned to the Free Exercise Clause. So the Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment is basically our guarantee to have free exercise of religion. in response to the proliferation of educational choice programs, what different opponents started doing was to look at the Blaine Amendment to their state constitutions. I'm sure people in this audience are familiar with the Blaine Amendment, but just to give a quick overview of it, this was basically this amendment that, or failed amendment rather, that almost became law as an amendment to the United States Constitution, basically in response to the large-scale Catholic immigration to this country. And it had its origins in the fact that over 150 years ago or so, most of the public schools in this country were not the sort of secular, non-sectarian public schools that we have today. They were, in fact, like Protestant schools. And so when you had all these Catholic immigrants coming to this country, they very naturally were a little bit put off by the fact that they send their kids to schools where they were taught things that they believed to be untrue, that their tax dollars went to go pay for it, and so on. And they protested against it. And at the time, this was like a very very volatile issue in American politics. There were riots. There were the Philadelphia Bible riots in the 19th century. There was violence. There was lots of property being destroyed and lots of just kind of like vociferous opposition, both to any kind of money going to Catholic schools, but also to Catholics themselves. And this right here is this kind of infamous cartoon from Harper's Weekly, in which you have basically kind of like a red-blooded American defending the kids from these crocodiles that are actually the bishops coming to eat their children and take them away. And in the background, you see an upside-down American flag that's been destroyed by by the Catholics and the Pope and the bishops and everything. So this is the kind of well-reasoned and not at all hysterical atmosphere in which the Blaine Amendments were adopted. And so basically what you have in the Blaine Amendments are something where you'll have language to the effect of saying that no public money can go to sectarian schools. And at the time, sectarian was just a code word for Catholic, because Catholics were seen as just a sect, both a political, like religious kind of sect. And anyway, even as the Blaine Amendment failed at the federal level, it was adopted by something like 37 different states. And IJ had long had its eye on taking down the Blaine Amendment because we viewed it as being one of the major impediments to having educational choice programs in states. As part of my job, I talked to a lot of legislators. Different legislators would say to me, "Look, I'd love to help you, but the Blaine Amendment, it says that we can't have any money going to sectarian schools." And this basically came to a head in an IJ case called Espinoza versus Montana Department of Revenue. And basically what happened there was that Montana had adopted a tax credit scholarship program. And in response to the tax credit scholarship program, the Department of Revenue promulgated a regulation saying, okay, people can use this program, but you cannot use this program to go to a sectarian school. And then we challenged it. We challenged this regulation, and then it went to the Montana Supreme Court, and the Montana Supreme Court just basically struck down the program as a whole. And IJ challenged that. And the question presented that we asked the U.S. Supreme Court was, does it violate the religion clauses of the Constitution to invalidate a generally available and religiously neutral student aid program simply because the program affords students the choice of attending religious schools? Happily, once again, this U.S. Supreme Court agreed with us, but they took a very almost narrow approach. And what they said was that what happened there was that the Montana Supreme Court had engaged in religious status discrimination. It said that even if the Montana Department of Revenue had the goal of preventing religious uses of scholarship monies, that the application of the Blaine Amendment still turned on the religious status of the schools that parents attend. And the sort of seminal language from that opinion from Chief Justice Roberts is that a state need not subsidize private education, but once it does, it cannot disqualify some schools, private schools, because they are religious. And this was a very big victory, very significant, because it made clear that the U.S. Constitution does not condone discrimination based on religion, based on who you are. But at the same time, it left a question open. it left the question of religious use discrimination. Like, is religious use discrimination okay, even if religious status discrimination is not? And so this is the sort of distinction that only like a lawyer can love. And so, but Justice Gorsuch pointed this out in the case and saying, this religious status, religious use discrimination, what are we talking about here? The right to not be discriminated based on being religious is meaningless if you can be discriminated against for doing religious things. So in other words, let's say you can't be discriminated against because you want to attend a Catholic school or because you are Catholic, but you can be discriminated against once you start doing all those kinds of Catholic things. So what basically ended up happening was that even though the court was very, very clear in its Espinoza decision, Maine, basically saw this opening with this religious status, religious use discrimination thing, and they said, oh, well, we're not discriminating based on religious status, we're discriminating based on religious use, wink, wink, that's totally fine. And Maine sort of has kind of like an interesting history in that they, like a lot of like several northeastern states, it's a very rural area, and so rather than having public schools everywhere, they basically give what are the equivalent of vouchers that kids can just take these vouchers and they can use them either at public schools or at private schools throughout the state. And Maine had this rule that it adopted in 1980 saying that, you can go to any of these schools in the state, but you can't use these vouchers to go to schools that are doing religious things. We brought this case up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the court held that actually discrimination based on religious status and use is unconstitutional under the Free Exercise Clause, and that we've repeatedly held that a state violates the Free Exercise Clause when it excludes religious observers from otherwise available public benefits. And so basically this ends up kind of closing the circle on the major constitutional issues that arose when the first educational choice program was created over 30 years ago. So just to recap, the major issues were involving the First Amendment, specifically first, the Establishment Clause, whether when you have money that goes to students who use them at religious schools, whether that violates the establishment of religion, and the second involving the Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment, which is whether the state can discriminate against a recipient based on the recipient's religious status or on how they seek to use those public benefits. And as a consequence of these major decisions, it's easier to constitutionally easier, let's say, to enact an educational choice program today than ever before. And I think it's probably no coincidence that in 2020, that was, I think, the biggest year that we had. I think it was like 18 states adopted educational choice programs. We're hoping that this year, 2023, will be even bigger or maybe even more significant, but it's a very big deal. So, of course, now that these big problems have been solved, the other side is just going to give up, right? Randy Weingarten is just going to say, I surrender and go home, right? No. So it's basically been the strategy of teachers' unions and of other opponents of school choice to just basically always be suing about these programs, to basically have them always cast under a cloud. So it'll depress our enthusiasm for these programs. It'll depress people who want to participate but fear that if they put their kid into one of these schools with a scholarship, that all of a sudden the program will be struck down if they're always being sued, if they're always being under like a legal cloud. So what we've seen is that since Espinoza and Carson, but really even before that, the opponents of educational choice programs have really been shifting to other kinds of challenges. So, for example, in Tennessee, they sued and lost over a case involving the Home Rule Amendment, which basically meant that there was a program in the state that specifically focused on kids who were in failing schools, and the teachers sued about that, saying that violates this provision of the Constitution because it only applies to one part of the school. And then in Ohio, we're currently in a sort of similar litigation where they're saying that once because the state has an obligation to establish a system of public schools, that it can't do anything else, that basically serves as a ceiling, not a floor. And the last one that I'm personally involved in is this really ridiculous case out of New Hampshire, in which there's basically $1 billion that goes into the educational trust fund, and that money is partially used to fund a very tiny scholarship program that's about $6 million. And because out of this $1 billion, there's also, I think, $100 million that is constitutionally protected. They're saying, well, if this money is constitutionally protected, we have no way of knowing whether this $100 million goes into the $6 million program, so therefore it's unconstitutional. And so the purpose of all of these different cases is to basically, again, depress turnout, depress people's enthusiasm for these programs, and to just basically cast a cloud over it, and to just get them all mired down in litigation. So just in closing, it's been a very significant journey over the past 30 years. We've won a lot of very significant cases. The constitutionality of these cases is pretty clear, but it still means that we need to be very diligent about ensuring that whenever educational choice legislation is being considered by various legislators, that it's still constitutional. Because there may be different things in various state constitutions that we need to take care of, and it's very important that we have well-drafted legislation. And if you have questions about legislation, please come to me and my colleagues at We'll take a look at it, and we want to work with you as well as legislators to ensure that we have as much educational choice across the country as possible, and that when these programs get challenged in court, as they will definitely get challenged, that we can defend them and say that, no, they are absolutely constitutional. And with that, thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Could you say a little bit more about how the Equal Protection Clause issue is going to play out? I think in Maine, they've been doing a non-discrimination attack on the funded schools, saying that, well, now we have this generally applicable law, and so none of the religious schools are going to be able to get money anyway. Is that the same issue, and how do you see it playing out?
Yeah, the Equal Protection Clause argument is that we're talking about, I think, in that we're dealing with in Ohio. I'm not familiar with one in Maine. Is sort of interesting. Basically what they're doing is that they're making this argument that the Equal Protection Clause also, it encompasses segregation, and they're saying what their argument is that educational choice programs are basically a backhanded way of facilitating segregation. And it's something that's pretty ridiculous once you look at the different statistics of participation in educational choice programs, and particularly in Ohio. So it may be that in certain schools or school districts, there might be a slightly higher percentage of, let's say, white students who leave the school districts and go to a private school using an educational choice scholarship. But the vast majority of participants using educational choice programs, not vast majority, but the disproportionate number of students using educational choice programs in Ohio, at least, are African American, they're Hispanic, and they're using them out of all proportion to their population. So you might have, let's say, 25% of the population in Ohio being African American, but you'd have 40% of participants in the educational choice program being African American. And so what the other side is trying to do is they're trying to cherry pick different examples where there might be different kinds of disparities. But when you look at the overall picture of data, it's very, very clear that the vast majority of that not the vast majority, that there's a strikingly disproportionate number of minorities who use educational choice programs compared to everyone else. And that sort of defeats the segregation argument that the other side is trying to make using the Equal Protection Clause.
Can you talk a bit about the school choice pending school choice legislation and maybe where it doesn't go far enough, or how it looks to you guys?
Sure. So I think that Ginny mentioned in Arkansas that they just passed this universal school choice program, and that's wonderful. And it would have been hard to believe that they would have done a universal school choice program because just a couple of years ago, my colleagues and I were working basically day and night to get this very, very dinky, like $3 million program across the finish line that would serve, I think, like 500 kids, like in total. So I think that legislators are thinking big. And I think that, as Corey DeAngelis probably said last night, it's sort of become a litmus test for a lot of Republican candidates about who can have like the biggest educational choice program, who can deliver most for their kids. And I think that the future, at least the temporary future of these programs, is very bright. I think COVID was a very shocking, was a big shock to the public school system, and it caused a lot of parents to really want to investigate different kinds of options. And where we are right now is that all of these different legislators and all these different parents all over the country are very excited about getting something through. But it's also very important at the same time for us to not only have these programs be constitutional and well-designed, but also to make them as big as possible. Because once you have a built-in constituency who are enthusiastic about these kinds of programs, they're just not going anywhere. And I remember a couple of years ago, I think that Bill wrote a piece for the Wall Street Journal, talking about how in Florida, the former Democratic gubernatorial candidate lost by, maybe 30,000 votes or something like that, and a huge percentage of them were driven by African-American women voting Republican. And I think that there's probably no constituency in America that votes Republican less than African-American women, but they were voting that way because the Democratic candidate had promised to, basically limit or even shut down the school choice program that they had here. But that couldn't happen but he lost precisely because he promised to do that.
A question here about the Blaine amendments. Does the Supreme Court victory completely annihilate all state Blaine amendments overnight? Did that happen, or I couldn't read the captions on the map to say, what the various colors meant?
Sure. So basically, as far as it goes with the types of Blaine amendments, and these are the vast majority of Blaines that discriminate based on religion, so they might say that no public money can go to sectarian schools. Those are effectively a dead letter across the nation. However, there are other Blaine amendments that say no money can go to private schools, so regardless of religion. And different state Supreme Courts have interpreted this differently. In our view, some of them have interpreted them the right way, which is that, okay, so you can't have money go to a private school. You can't set aside $1 million to go to X private school. Fine. And they've made this distinction between money to private schools, bad. But they've said, but if you give money to individuals who then take them to private schools, then that's fine, because the benefit is for the student, not for the school. And so for those, we call them public-private Blaines, maybe about half of them have been interpreted the right way, and then there are others that have not. And I would say the states that have not interpreted them the right way, I think, are Hawaii, Alaska, and Arizona. But Arizona solved that problem by having an ESA program instead, which the court said was fine. A voucher program was not fine, but an ESA program was fine because the benefits went to many different entities, not just private schools. Okay.
So I know your talk didn't directly relate to this, but I get this question all the time, and it's a legal question related to schools, and I thought you might at least have some input on it. And that's, what should, as school choice grows, what should charter schools and potentially some of the private schools that are receiving state funding respond about the federal government's guidance regarding transgender students?
Oh, wow. So that's not a question I'm really going to answer. Just because, as a matter of institutional policy, like we deal with private school choice, we don't deal with public school choice, and it may end up being the case that the Supreme Court ends up deciding that charter schools are state actors, in which case, or not state actors for that matter, in which case it's going to change how we look at charter schools entirely, and that will certainly affect the interaction between public money and private institutions. But it's a question that's going to be answered by other people, and that we'll see in the fullness of time. And I see that my time is up, but thank you very much for your time. And